Hi guys, welcome to a new video. Today we're finally going to be implementing the JWT authentication filter. Before we begin doing that, from the last video I noticed that the attribute rows we didn't initialize it in the constructor. So in order to do this, we should go ahead and type this, that rows is the rows list that we are passing. Let me check something. Sorry for that. It seems like my CPU is working too much. Okay, no, it's okay. Okay, so we have to initialize the rows just like this one. And right now we're also going to be creating the class that we're going to be needing for the authentication filter. The first one is the authentication failure handler. So let's go to the folder security. I don't know what's the matter with the computer. And let's just make the class JWT authentication failure handler, and this class we're going to be using when the authentication fails. Okay, so later on we're going to implement it. Right now it's just for creation, and yeah, we should implement the classes. So authentication, the Spring authentication failure handler, and then of course implement the methods because it's an interface. Okay, so that's it for now. The next class that we're going to be using is the JWT authentication entry point, and this is for implementing authentication entry point. Okay, yes, this is for exception handling for authentication for Spring. So anything that goes wrong in the authentication process, it will go to this entry point and display the error, that's the exception that you put in there. So when we implement it, okay, so this is going to be implemented later on, also this one also, and then let's begin making the class authentication filter. So this is the JWT authentication filter, which extends, yes, the user name password authentication filter. And in here we have to extend overwrite a few methods, but we'll do that later on. One other thing that we have to make is the class that's going to be configured to configure the HTTP, so the Spring security configuration for JWT. So in there we're going to be registering the filters, etc, etc. So let's create it. So the JWT authentication config, and this class is going to be extending, let me see if I remember, it's going to be extending the web security configurer adapter. And don't forget to put this as configuration. Okay, and this one's also, but we'll do that later on. So this class, I'm going to be creating now a bin. We're going to be overriding it, and the method to override is the Authentication Manager bin. And this one is needed because we're going to be using and registering and coupling this Authentication Manager to this authentication later on. So that's why we need to create a bin of it so Spring Boot can recognize it and then inject it, auto wire it when the application runs. Okay, so that's it for now. We're going to close this right now, and we're going to be implementing this username password authentication. But before that, I want to make sure that you understand the custom user detail, and you have to make sure that if you pass the person object, you have to make sure that you pass all the lazy attributes in your person object as in the constructor, so as parameters in the constructor and as attributes in this class. So just like we did with rows, you have to make sure that all lazy attributes fetched are like that. So rows, we know that is lazy because many-to-many defaults to lazy, just like here. So that's why we have to pass the rows and save it as an attribute in the class. Otherwise, when we use this class later on in this authentication filter, we're not going to be able to get the rows because there's not going to be an active proxy. That has something to do with Spring Data GPA, the way it works. So make sure that all lazy initialized objects or attributes in the person class or whatever class you want to use here are passed as a constructor and initialized and saved as an attribute in the class. Okay, if you have everything fetched to eager, is not a problem, but all lazy fetched attributes, okay, or fields, whatever you want to call it. Okay, so the next thing I want to speak a little bit about is that in the last video I didn't mention some downside of the JWT cookie-based authentication. So right now I'm going to mention 3 of them. The first one is that your site has to connect to the same domain that the cookie is made for. So you know that cookies are domain-based. Every time you send a request, the browser automatically attaches the cookie to the request. So that's one downside. So you don't have cross origins here. So you cannot be on a website and then send a request to another domain. The domain has to be the same. One way of a workaround here is that you can create the same cookie, so the same JWT token cookie, and then just create different cookies which each of them a different domain that you're going to be using, that you're going to be connecting to. Okay, another one is that the cookie there that we're going to be making that contains the JWT token is not accessible by JavaScript, and that is just by design because we're going to be setting the cookie only HTTP, and that's a downside because you cannot access the information in the JWT cookie. You will have to create, or you have to create another cookie with the details, with the information that you need, or you can also get it as an object, as a JSON, and save it in the local storage. So that is another downside. And for the ones that don't like CSRF protection, you'll have to implement it when you're working with cookies. Okay, work with cookies and post and put and delete HTTP methods. Okay, so that's it. Let's begin with the authentication filter. The first thing we're going to be doing is mark this as a component, so Spring Boot can recognize it. And then we're going to be using another Lombok annotation that is used for logging. Okay, so the first one, since we're going to be needing a object, so we're going to be needing to write to the response. So one way of doing it is by creating a field of object mapper, and this mapper we're going to be used to serialize the object into JSON. So that's the object, and the other one that we're going to be using is the JWT properties. So we get the name, we can get the expiration, all the JWT properties, and we're going to auto-wire it so Spring can inject it automatically. So we're going to create the constructor nodes to initialize that field. We're going to be auto-wiring the constructor, which is authentication filter, and the object mapper here. So Spring will automatically create the object mapper for us, and we just have to assign it to our local mapper. Okay, the next thing we have to do is every implementation that extends username password authentication has to have an authentication manager. So we're going to be using the default one, and we're going to be setting it with a setter. No, not that one, but overriding methods. So here we're going to be saying set authentication manager, this one, and we're going to be just auto-wiring it, because this auto-wired, when we auto-wire this, Spring Boot is going to get this authentication manager instance from the JWT authentication config that we just created here. So this bin right over here. Okay, so the next thing we need to override is the authentication failure handler that we're going to be using when authentication fails, when there's an exception. So we're going to be auto-wiring. No, let's just override the method first, and that method is called set authentication failure handler, supposed to be right here. Okay, so that's another method, and this also is going to be auto-wired, and this auto-wiring is going to be handled also by Spring Boot, and it's going to be this class that we just created. Only thing we have to do here is put add component to make the error go away in this class. Okay, so it's not an error anymore. Okay, so the next thing we have to do is overriding the actual method that is going to be doing the authentication. So we're going to override again, and we're going to be overriding the attempt authentication methods. Okay, so this one has to return a authentication object, and that authentication object we're going to be making when we get the information that's going to be sent by post, which is a JSON object which contains a username and password. So let's begin implementing it. So first, what we're going to be doing is checking if the user is already authenticated. So if he has already sent a token. So let's create authentication object, and then we're going to go to the security context holder object. This is the context holder that holds the authentication user. I'm going to use get context and then get authentication, and After that, we're going to be checking if this authentication is null or the authentication, sorry for that, the authentication that is authenticated. So if it's not authenticated, if that is true, then we're going to be trying to authenticate. Otherwise, we're going to throw an exception that we already made in the previous video. So it is the exception of throw, I don't know if you remember, out already authentication exception. And we don't have to put the message because later on in the authentication filter handler, we're going to catch this type of exception, and there we're going to be sending a message back as a JSON to the caller. Okay, so this method, this class is here. We already created it in the previous video. Okay, so if it's not authentication, so if authentication is null and it's not authenticated, we're going to be trying to authenticate. So we're going to be creating a person here, object, just declare it, and then we're going to be wrap this in a try and catch in case any errors happen. And then the first thing we're going to be is assigning the person, and we're going to be using this mapper, and we're going to be using read value, and this method requires either a request. No, it requires a lot of things. You can you can choose a lot of things, but we have already the request, so we're going to be using the request and get reader. So that's the reader of the request, and then we're going to try to parse this and see if there's an object that can be serialized or deserialized to the JSON object that can be deserialized to this person that class. Okay, so if it is successful in deserializing and make an object out of it, we're going to do something else. So first we have to check if the person is not null. And also check immediately if the username we're going to be using the Apache comments dependency that we imported in the POM to check if the username is empty or null or only white space. Okay, so only if this person is not null and this username is not blank, then we're going to be proceeding by checking the password. So if it's not blank also, and then if all is good, then we're going to be creating a username password authentication token, which is of type authentication. Okay, abstract authentication, and this one is the one that we're going to be sending or returning in this method. Okay, so let's initialize it. We're going to be saying username password authentication token, and this method requires an object principal and object credentials. So we're going to be using the first method because it's not authentication yet, it's not authenticated yet, so we don't have the roles. Okay, so we don't need to pass the roles. So if everything is good, you have some username and you have some password. And then this token, we're going to pass it down to the Authentication Manager that we created a bin for. So this is default Spring Security Authentication Manager, and it's going to be using the authenticate method so we can authenticate this person. So here you pass the token that we just created, and this method is going to be returning an authentication object to return here after all the authentication is done by Spring. Okay, so that's it for the attempt authentication. And here we're going to be just logging the error. There's not much we can do here. And then and then throw at the end, we're going to be throwing the bad credentials exception. Okay, and this bad credentials exception, so Spring, so the compiler or whatever the program can only reach this line of code if something is wrong. So if the person is null, or it has a blank username or password or something like that, a null or something, or if something goes wrong, also it's going to be reaching here. Okay, so that means that something went wrong with the authentication. Okay, so that's it for the attempt authentication. Right now we're going to be moving on to overriding some other methods that are needed, and I think you can think what those other methods can be. One is for the successful authentication. So when this returns the authentication object, Spring is either going to be throwing an unsuccessful exception, or is going to be going through the method that handles successful authentication. So here you can see that there's a method that handles unsuccessful authentication. Here we're not going to be doing anything because we don't have anything to do, but for example, if you have something to do here, you can do it. So maybe you want to I don't know, you want to log the login attempts that the user does. Here you can increment by 1 because it's unsuccessful, etc, etc. And I just override this method so I can show you that there's an unsuccessful authentication method that you can use in case something goes wrong and you want to log or you want to do something else. Okay, and the next method we're going to be overriding is the successful authentication method, and in this method we're going to be creating the JWT authentication token and the cookie that holds this token. So let's bring it and break it to make it more readable. So let's begin. So the first thing we need is the authentication. So this custom user detail that we created here, we need it back so we can set, so we can get the rows, we can get the username, we can get all the information that we threw in there, that we saved in there, in order not to query the database again. So you can maybe pass only the username here, but then you will have to query the database, find the user again, and then you can get the rows. But if you put all the information that you're going to be needing here, you don't have to even touch the database. Okay, but in the next video I'm going to show you this, because this video is already too long. So in the next video I'm going to be showing you how you can create the JWT token. Okay, and then we're going to do some Postman tests so you can actually see the token getting created. Okay, so I will see you in the next video.